What would you pay to extend your life? What if that cost was somebody else's life? Would you pay?
And with that ominous intro, welcome to this week's episode of the 800's. I am your co-host, Alex, and for some reason, my audio on Twitch is going. Give me just a moment, folks. I apologize. All right, there we go. Anyways, I am your co-host, Alex, and you just heard from my fabulous co-host who can actually do his job, Adam. And
That's a stretch. Don't get ahead of yourself.
And a special thank you, as always, to our tech man, Alan, behind the scenes, making this all possible. Thank you, Alan. And with that, why don't we just roll into our plugs for the week?
Yes. If you joined us for our pre-show, as always, you heard Fearless First by Incompetech. Incompetech is our favorite audio streaming platform. Well, I guess it's not really an audio streaming. Audio downloading platform. That's the right term. Incompetech has some great tunes. You should check them out at incompetech.filmmusic.io. Also, we have a YouTube channel where we post all these videos and a bunch of other stuff like D&D things and other cool nerdy things. So go check out our YouTube channel. Links below the video. And if you're like me and love audiobooks, you should check out Audible. dmstable.com/audible gets you a free 1-month subscription and one audiobook of your choosing. I would suggest the next one that we're going to do for the show, which is Dune. I love audiobooks. I listen to almost every single book we do on here. I think I've only read one so far and listened to all the other ones. And the one that I read, I have listened to before. So, yeah, audiobooks are the way to go in my mind, but that's not for everybody. I would suggest you check it out, though. It's pretty cool. Finally, I want to talk about Patreon. We have a Patreon page, links below the video. The Patreon is where we post our future book choices. So if you join and become a patron on Patreon, you can tell us what to do. So it's pretty cool. Tonight's vote is actually still ongoing. It'll end at about 9:15. So if you want to get in on that vote, go over to the Patreon link down below the video and join us. Otherwise, Alex, tell us what we're doing tonight.
Let me think. This week on the 800's, we will be discussing Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro as a part of our Asian and Pacific Islander authors series. Our book this week takes place in an alternate version of 90s United Kingdom, where a certain segment of the population live their lives mostly apart from the rest. Our main character, Kathy, is what is known as a carer in this segment, and we are taken back on a journey through her life as a clone.
That was good. If you're joining us for the first time tonight, just a quick overview of how things work on the 800's. Alex and I love to talk, but we also love to talk about things that you guys want to talk about. So we're going to pitch topics or questions, and we'll talk about them back and forth to give you guys in chat an opportunity to respond. But we also would like to hear from you guys if you guys have something that you want to talk about. So go ahead anytime you want, put a topic or question in the chat that you want to talk about, and we'll address it as soon as we can. But otherwise, we'll bounce back and forth and talk about what chat likes and all that stuff.
All right, and as always, quick disclaimer and reminder, this is a show primarily made for adults. We do cover adult themes, topics, and while we try not to rely on it, we do occasionally swear. Also, we're trying to build a friendly and fun community here of nerds and even regular folks who just like to share hobbies and be supportive of those hobbies. So, in short, be nice or fuck right off.
Right off.
I felt it was appropriate for our British location in the book. You can just fuck right off.
With that, let's get right into the questions. Alex and chat, what were your first impressions of the book?
Well, I actually started out reading this book, like actually reading it and then I reread it via audiobook, and across the board, it is a slow burn. I'm like, this is not an action like thriller, gripping your seat in any way, and it can be a bit of a trudge, especially in the beginning. There are good elements to it, and I found myself enjoying parts of books that I don't usually, but that's because it was completely bereft of other things I usually enjoy and typically enjoy more. The parts that it did well, it did very well, but it's my first impression is definitely not for everybody.
Yeah, I not to be too harsh, but if I had been listening to it on my own accord, I don't think I would have continued past my 25% judgment mark on this one. It was a very slow start, and to me, it felt like it was just a story about some kids in school. And by the way, they happen to be clones of other people. So,
Well,
yeah, I
honest, go ahead.
okay. I wasn't a fan of the writing style, of the first person narrative style the author chose. I wasn't a fan of the story. Um, and there just wasn't a lot of draw right from the gate. So for me, it was a hard struggle through to get to the end.
Yeah, I think it could be really hard, particularly if you don't really connect with one of the characters, like because it's so character focused that if you don't get in it with at least one of them, it's going to be really hard to make it through to the parts that have more broad appeal. Like you said, that first 25% of the book, because you're basically looking through the eyes of one person and the few people that she interacts with, then like again, it's very easy to miss. If it hits, I could see how it can hit home pretty heavily for some people. Like it sounds like V.S. Drake uh, liked it and is glad they got through it. I apologize. I've got the hiccups going right now.
Inexcusable. You need to be perfect, Alex.
Calm down, damn it. I do like how V.S. Drake, how you phrase it is a very honest and weird, and it kind of owns that. But again, if it's not your kind of weird, it's just going to be a swing and a miss. And it sounds like that's kind of what it was for you, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, so it's obviously a fictional story. And for me, I don't know, I look for more escape from the mundane in fiction. And this book just doesn't have that. It's more about what could the nitty gritty of society be? What could be the worst aspect that we could portray? And that's just not really what I look for when I'm picking out a book. So just not my style. I'm sure a lot of people like it, but it wasn't for me.
Yeah. Well, that's actually kind of what I really did like about it is it took a different aspect of that. Like I've found myself sometimes in movies, like especially if it's like like a post-apocalyptic movie where I've seen it a few times and then I know what the movie's about, so I can kind of let my mind wander and think about certain aspects of it. Like, I wonder what like the day-to-day life is like when, they aren't being like, they aren't trying to save the world or something like that, and it gives kind of a glimpse into what that would look like if a dystopian future was just accepted as it is and nobody's really questioning it, and the few people who do still give into it, it's a very unique take in that regard. But again, if you're looking for what you said you're looking for, Adam, it definitely misses that mark by a wide margin. So like again, and that's what I meant by it's not for everybody. This was, I think, the best way that I was able to phrase it, at least in my own head, is that this was a book for, like, this is a literary critic's book. Like it's not meant to be broad appeal. It's meant to be for people who are like, it seems like it was written for people who are into literature just for the sake of literature, not necessarily for yeah, I know story's a part of it, but there's a lot more power in the literary devices used in this book, I thought, than the actual story. Uh,
Yeah, I had
yeah.
I had problems with the rambling nature of the story though,
Hmm.
because the narrator does jump around all over the place, and it seemed like she had a hard time transitioning. At the beginning, she kind of stopped it about halfway through, but anytime she wanted to transition, she'd go, anyways, and then say something, and then talk about that for a while, and then say, anyways, talk about that for a while. Um, that really got under my skin kind of quick, and so for me, even from a critic perspective, like I didn't feel like this writing was that great.
Oh, and I think it's an issue with style, and as V.S. Drake said, you didn't find the story compelling. There, yeah, V.S. Drake also mentions foreshadowing wasn't great. It was pretty straightforward. It felt more like a very long conversation and a very one-sided conversation than it did like reading. And if you're not into that, then it can definitely miss, at least in those particular regards. So, uh, why don't we move on to like maybe a more specific question? Um, what were your initial theories about who they were? Like, let's get into that question that V.S. Drake mentions is like, are they human? This is inspired by that. It's like, what were your initial theories about who these people were and why their lives were so weird?
That's yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, like VS Drake's saying, I thought they were clones. Um, the shoot, I forget. I asked earlier what it was. The movie, the movie where they do the clones of the people. Um, the island. It threw off the island vibes. I know at one point was it Rose suggested that they were copies of like drug addicts and hookers and slums and just whoever happened to be around. But I was definitely thinking from the get go that they were clones of rich people who wanted a way to cheat death. How about
Yeah.
you?
I personally was, again, my initial instinct was, again, the island. Like, I saw too many similar themes, but it's the island without the lottery aspect. Like, it's a quiet acceptance, not a of something that they already know. But I thought they were in like something like the island, like a tower, where like everything that they knew about the outside world was a simulation. And I think the biggest thing that I was wrong about is the fact that visiting Norfolk was actually a thing they could do. Like, they could
Yeah.
actually get out for a little bit. I didn't think that was going to actually happen. That's where I missed the mark entirely. I thought they were going to be like on the farm, they turn a certain age, and then they're basically kept, like they're moved to like a different area and basically kept alive until they're ready to be harvested. Like, I was waiting for it to go like full on dystopian, like nightmare, and it was just like, uh again, that weird quiet acceptance of this thing. And I think the other thing that threw me is they talk about multiple donations, and how you complete, like, most people complete after like 3 donations. I'm like, how many things can you donate like, and still be alive at the end of it? Like, what, you could donate a kidney, you can donate parts of parts of your liver, and then blood.
Yeah.
Like, that was the other thing I thought, is maybe they weren't organ donations so much as it was for like blood transfusions and things like that. you
I
know
wonder. So like, I know like if you chop your finger off and you manage to get it in time, they can reattach it. I kind of wonder if that was a thing where like they would take body parts off and go and reattach it to their real life counterpart.
I mean, maybe it's. I think that might be where you get the ones that wind up with more. Just because I was just so unsure about like where there could be more. I honestly only briefly thought of that, and it wasn't until actually probably today that I thought about that when I reread through it in the audiobook or finished reading through it. But the first time I read it, I was just like, oh, blood donations, maybe a liver or kidney, and then they get out. But no, it seems like as you read on, it seems like they actually harvest, like most people apparently die after their second donation,
Yeah.
or I think the way they phrase it in the book is that it happens more than they let on, and that would make the most sense, especially if things are going in quick order. But getting into the chat though with VS Drake, the visiting Norfolk being them dying, I definitely had that thought early on. I was just like, oh, you get to visit Norfolk, and because like again, I was in that island setting. The visiting Norfolk was the equivalent of getting the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know.
definitely. It wasn't until they were actually there. It was like, oh, okay, they actually mean they go to some village.
BS Drake said they also imagined the limbs, so like you guys are definitely in on that. I went straight to like blood and organs because when I think like tissue donation of any kind, like that's or bio donation, that's where my mind went. You know,
I guess that would be the question is like, so are they donating for a specific person, or is this like anybody who they happen to be a match with? Because like, what are the odds that every single person there ends up needing a liver or something? You know?
well, it might be something you could extend to family members, but it is pretty much confirmed later in the book that it was like a single person, or at least that's what they're told, and that comes around with the idea of possibles, as in your possible model, you know, or models is the other term they use. So your genetic model. But actually, now that I think about it, you're right. It isn't 100% cleared up whether or not it is for a specific person. But if it's blood, I could see you donating like that. But if it's organs and stuff, the whole point of having clones for organ donation is to have something your body won't reject. There's so many factors that go into organ donation that go beyond just blood type. Like it's red blood type. You need your white blood cells to accept the organ tissue, which they will often reject without special medications. You need but you also need them to work well enough to actually heal where it's been attached, and getting that balance right in all the different, like the platelet counts that go into it. There's a lot more that you have to match than just blood type when you're giving those
Right.
sorts of things, and that's the whole point of having a clone, is you don't have to question any of that. You instantly have somebody who can make that match. And
Yeah,
clone
that's obviously the biggest factor of having a clone, but you also have a bigger pool to pull from other than just, car accident victims or, you
yeah,
know.
maybe that's what happens to people whose model dies. Is if you're a clone and your model dies, then you just go to like the next closest person. you know they don't really talk about that because
Yeah.
again, there's so little pushback from the clones in this scenario. And I found it fascinating how they kept them uh, complicit, or no, not complicit, compliant with that sort of thing. Uh,
Let's talk about VS Drake here. Um Man, his choice in numbers for his username are just real. No, I'm just kidding. Um, he said, I thought it was interesting how they viewed sex. That was something I had wanted to talk about tonight. What did you think about their view on essentially personal gratification and relationships between each other?
I thought it was so highly manipulative on the part of the people watching over, like the clones, because basically they gave them just enough of a taste of it that they would want it. They would realize there's something worth living for. They realize that they are giving them just enough to make life worth living so that they don't revolt and they don't commit suicide. But they also make it so difficult to engage with those things that it makes them reliant on the system to get it in some way. And they're told about things that are, they give them hope essentially for something better. And that little bit of hope they do through mostly relationships. That comes in the form of deferrals later in the book, in the form of sex in the beginning, and teaching them to deny impulses is also highly manipulative, because by denying impulses, you know, they don't have quite the same emotional reactions to, you know, this prospect of completing, you know. And it is a little weird just the way that they interact with each other concerning it. There's such a naivete to it, you know. And I'm trying to think about it in the context of the 90s, because they're talking about porn magazines and
Yeah.
you know, and it was like, it's been a while. Like that was already starting to phase out when we hit like 18, when we could get those things, let alone, you know, what it would have been 10, you know, what it is now, where like if you actually have handled a porn magazine, you're probably much more in the minority than the majority for people growing up nowadays who've just turned 18, you know.
Yeah. I definitely think there's, so I had a particular grievance about this subject in the book, because like I didn't feel like how they viewed their personal relationships with each other is how it really would have played out. um like I feel like they would have had stronger, more intimate relationships with each other, because they were the only ones they really had in their lives. Like their teachers were something else. They weren't the clones, you know, they were separate. They, from the very beginning, it was made known that the students were special and the teachers were something different altogether. So I really thought that they would have formed like these really close personal bonds with each other. And you didn't really see that. It was more of a cavalier, I'm going to bounce around and be friends with whoever kind of attitude.
I think V.S. Drake makes a good does a good way of summing that up and saying that their personal relationships didn't feel human, and I think that's what made me make it feel manipulated, like it was manipulated from the outside, is because assuming that they are human clones and there isn't a way to just turn off personal relationships, like it feels like there's some outside force keeping it from being human, that or they found a way to genetically just turn off, you know, the instinct to create depth of relationship, you know. So yeah, I like the way you put that, VS Drake, is it didn't feel human. It was disjointed. That's actually a really good term too. It was so weird, especially like the relationship between like our three main character, like our main character and her two best friends, Tommy and Ruth. Like that was just such a weird triangular dynamic. It wasn't even like a love triangle, but maybe that's the thing, is that you get these people from who are clones, so they aren't, you know, they're raised in a very specific environment, but you know, maybe that's what's disjointed about it, is that they are cloned from donors from all over the place, and whatever genetic memory or genetic uh, behavior and instinct is from all over, but they're all put into one place. I don't know. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch because it's the UK, but I'm just kind of bullshitting at this point. So,
Yeah. Were they really human?
man,
That's a good question. So obviously that was the point of the artwork, right?
mm-hmm.
I lost my
Your
There it is. My live show question document.
all right.
I lost it in the tabs. I was looking up something. Yeah, I'd like to address that next if you don't mind. Were they
Oh, yeah.
were they really human? Do you think the artwork actually helped their cause or hurt their cause?
That part is the one bit that it's one of the main reasons I actually went back and reread the book is I picked up that in the beginning with the artwork in the gallery, especially when they talk about Tommy's conversation with Miss Lucy about like, I was wrong, the artwork is important, it's all there is, like that is the record of their humanity, or supposed humanity. And I wanted to say yes, but what convinced me was actually Tommy's artwork continuing outside when he talks about creating those imaginary animals and wondering about how they lived, how they survived, how they reached things, these little questions. And that was probably one of the most human moments in the entire book. Like, honestly, Tommy was probably my favorite character. He was a ditz, but he was probably my favorite character. Actually, I just realized now that might be the first time since the very first book we did, Way of King, like the Way of Kings, that might be the first time that the main character, a guy, has actually been my favorite character. Is now that I think about it, like outright been my favorite character. But anyway, random thought off the top of my head because I thought that was weird. But yeah, I was so unsure up until that point, and I figured, yeah. And then he tries to call it into question at the end. They aren't treated like they're human. Certainly, they're treated like, I don't know. It felt like they were treated almost like ghosts of humans, like that people just kind of accepted were there, but they weren't. If it was known what and who they were, then they just weren't treated like human. And I wonder how much of that has to do, has an impact on how they interact with the world. And, and it does bring up the question of, is humanity self-determined or is it externally determined?
Yeah. I think so. I'm going to answer this twofold: art and internal. I was surprised when the gallery part was revealed that lady who was trying to do all that stuff to essentially shut Havisham, whatever, the school,
Hailsham.
the lady who was trying to shut the school down.
Mm-hmm.
I was really surprised she didn't do more to like disrupt the goings on there. Like it felt like she should have been more passionate about getting the kids to understand you guys are pawns in somebody else's life. Like, in the eyes of your teachers, you don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it was only that one teacher who ended up leaving that showed compassion towards them. And I think
I think that was Miss Lucy.
Yeah. I don't remember who it was, but we'll go with Miss Lucy. A big thing for me is if you don't show a kid compassion when they're growing up, they're probably not going to show compassion in other aspects of their life, which we kind of see with their personal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they internally, like, they're human,
Mm-hmm.
but they were degraded to a state of non-human because of their upbringing.
I really like that, honestly. I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think that's where we can round back to where VS Drake said it felt disjointed. It wasn't completely broken away from humanity as it probably was before the Hailsham people, but
Mm-hmm.
it was disjointed from humanity because, like you said, like it's a nature versus nurture thing. You know, if you don't treat somebody like a human, can they become human? And if you do, does it make them as such? And you know, I think it was, again, I think it was kind of planted back in the beginning, that idea, and winds up being this bombshell moment at the end. In fact, I don't know if anybody out there has ever watched Community. Have you, Adam?
Nope.
Okay. Well, for anybody who has, in Community, there's this episode where one of the main characters, uh, it's a group of people at a community college, and there's a well-known main character who, while the rest of the cast is going through the A storyline, if you watch in the background, this main character befriends a pregnant woman and then eventually helps her deliver a baby. And this all happens in the background. You don't hear a word of it. You just see it happening, and but you have to ignore the main story to see that happening. And then at the end of the season, that main character comes out of nowhere and helps one of the other main characters deliver their baby, and only had the knowledge because of that background story. And that's kind of what this book felt like. It felt like we were watching that main compelling part be the background character. You had to phase out, you know, the bulk of this story to see that compelling background part. And unfortunately, it's a lot harder to do that in a book than it is in, you know, a television or like film setting. And like, because it can be really, and again, I thought it did a really good job of ending the book in the most frustrating, questioning, weird way. But to get there, you know, you had to kind of almost blur what was in the front, what was right in front of you, to see what was behind it. And uh, I think that was most prominent in the particular subject we were just talking about, this idea of humanity. Like, it, you know, it's in the background, it's in the background, it's in the background, then bam, punches you in the face right at the very end.
Yeah. I'll yeah, I'll say I think you're right about that, probably.
uh I I do like the fact that we find out that Hailsham, like, this is something I never predicted, because when they were talking about Hailsham, I know they talked about it being like them being different from the rest, but I just assumed like they were the clones of the richest of the rich, you know, not they were entirely different from all the rest. Like, the rest were treated, it sounds like, treated essentially like cattle, you know, getting ready for slaughter, as opposed to being treated like human. And uh, I like that the way VSJ puts it is that it was a protest school. So here's a question that I think it's going to get a little philosophical in here: is if you lived in a society where cloning was allowed, and for years before you, people relied on clones and the technology surrounding it to live longer, better, healthier lives, and that, would you be able to accept that at the cost of somebody else's life?
So
Like,
it was already before we were born, already a thing that happens.
yeah, and you are living in a society, like, let's say you grew up in this alternate universe, you are growing up in the 90s, would you be able, like, how would you react to that, and would you be able to accept it?
I mean, I think that's the same. Well, not the same. I think that's similar to like the argument about, eating animals. Like, we accept it because that's the way it is. Like, it's just the thing. Like, we eat cows. And only a very small percentage of the population goes, yeah, but do we have to? Like, is that really the right thing to do? Because these plants over here, we can eat those and we're just fine. So I would take a similar, I think, aspect with that. Is I don't know where I personally would fall on it, because I mean that's a really hard thing to decide on a theoretical, but I think it would be widely accepted with a small percentage of the population going, we don't really have to do that. It would be fine if we just didn't.
Yeah, I think VS Drake has a good point. I think there'd also be a lot of people who might be against it until they needed it, until desperation kicked in. I mean, one of the things I wonder in this society is like, you know that they're kept at a certain distance from people um, when they're growing up, and I think if people ever saw like, I think if I ever saw like a face of it, like, because it's as humans we are kind of programmed to be attached to other human faces. And I think if I ever got to put a face to that sort of thing, it's something that would weird me out. But otherwise, like, we're really good at doing terrible things if we're allowed to distance ourselves from it, either physically or mentally. Like, there's a famous experiment about like using electricity to shock somebody, and people were more likely to give lethal doses of electricity if they were told by people in authoritative positions, if they didn't have to see or hear the reaction, see especially, but also hear the reactions of people. Like, they couldn't hear or see the harm they were doing, they just knew they were flipping switches. uh and they were like, so yeah, it is very easy for us to distance ourselves. And I think that honestly, if I grew up in that society and I was given that kind of distance, I would have a problem with it. I wouldn't have a problem with it. And like you said, that's actually a good analogy, is with meat in our society. I think there's a way to respect it, but it's an entire, we start getting into questions of consciousness and self-awareness. That is a whole other issue, and that's where I think the line would break for me between food and using living like humans, assuming that's what they are. you know
Yeah.
uh,
Another good example to riff off of popular culture is the Dark Knight Joker experiment with the two boats
yeah
that are bombed, and each boat has the other detonator. And the one guy who was like, just do it, just do it, just do it. And then he gets the detonator and can't do it.
yeah That's almost the reverse, I think, of what VS Drake said. I just saw their thing in chat. I like to eat meat, but not to kill things. Well, I mean, I as a hunter have always like been taught the opposite. Like, I had to know where my food came from. I had to get to know that and come to terms with it. And that's the kind of thing that, like, I wonder if that's maybe what these people are trying to do with Hailstrom School, is like not just prove their humanity, but get people to have to look their food in the eye and
Nice.
say, are you still okay with this? And it's a much tougher question when you're looking into the eyes of another human, let alone into your own eyes, because that's the other thing I wonder is, like, do the possible models ever meet, even in a surgery, their own? I mean, I would assume they're kept entirely separate from each other, but like, how weird would that be to just get wheeled past yourself going to an OR or something? That'd be
that would
so
that would
weird.
be the big question is they're allowed to go to Norfolk. Is that like a known thing in society? Like, hey, if you've got a clone, don't go to Norfolk because you might run into them.
And then there's that one possible, that they meet, and they say that it wasn't her, but I always got the vibe that it was. And that's something I wonder if anybody else got, is did you think any of them actually found their models, even though they implied that they didn't? Like, in particular, Ruth. Because,
I
go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on this. I think that's a good question. Um, I think that they had the right of it when they suspected that their clones or their model um, wasn't necessarily the same age as them. I'm thinking more of it's like you live 20, 30, 40 years. Maybe you have heart problems, so they grow you a clone. So your clone is 30, 40 years younger than you are. So I think it's very possible that they could have met their model, but never would have been able to guess it because they're completely different ages.
See, I was with you on that as well, where I thought, well, it seems like the type of thing that, well, one, you'd have, I assumed that these were, again, I was in island mode, especially the beginning. Uh, I was of the mindset like, oh, these are rich people buying it. One, you have to accumulate the wealth to do so. Two, when you are most likely to lose an organ is when you're, or have a failing organ is above the age of 40. And if, and you don't want another 40-year-old, busted up liver. You want a fresh young one if possible.
Yeah.
So, but that again, that's assuming that they are made like tailor made. And I was again also assuming that Hailsham was like specifically for that purpose. There might be more generic ones, but like I thought Hailsham specifically was like cream of the crop type of thing, or higher echelons of society. But it sounds like VS Drake was very much of they're the generic, stamp and print a model. And that may actually be the case, especially for the ones that are treated more like livestock, is like those ones might be, there might be variations of it. Like some are generic, some are very much so taken from like a person directly. And
Hey, Alex, I'm going to have to interrupt you real quick.
go ahead.
We're going to have some technical difficulties with our chat in a couple of minutes here. So we are going to go ahead and start wrapping up a little bit early tonight.
Yeah, apologize for that, folks.
So real quick, I'm going to give you guys the plugs, and then we'll talk about the next book and stuff like that.
All right.
Plugs. Okay. So at the bottom of the page, you'll see a bunch of links to Patreon, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. You should check all those out. We already talked about Patreon and YouTube, so I'm going to skip over those. But if you like what we do and you want to hear more, check us out on Twitter or Facebook. Our Twitter handle is @DMsTable. Our Facebook handle is @TheDMsTable. We chat a lot about what books are coming up and all that stuff, so you should check that out. Next up on the 800's, we're going to do Dune. And that is read by July 31st. So another long break for us here. Dune is a great book though, so you guys should definitely check it out. It's a little on the long and slow side, but some great books are like that.
Well, that's why we gave you guys the extra week to work on it. We know it's gonna take it a little bit longer, so get started now.
After that, we're going to do Foundry Side by Robert Bennett. That's for August 14th. That's one I've never read before, but I'm really looking forward to it. That's the one I was hoping was going to win, so that's very exciting. Real quick, why don't we talk final thoughts, because we've got 2 more minutes before we're going to have some difficulties. So, Alex, what were your final thoughts?
My final thoughts on this book were that I enjoyed it at the end. It took a while to come together. I would only recommend this to certain people. Like, I would be very selective about who I recommend this to. It wasn't my favorite, but I can definitely see it. I like books that make me question stuff, so I enjoyed that aspect of it. Could have taken the pace up a little bit in the beginning. So I thought it was okay, but okay to start, good ending.
All right, let me get mine in there. I didn't like it. I would not recommend it. It is not my cup of tea for sure. Too slow. The writing was too disjointed. It didn't feel like it had a purpose until about halfway through. So I didn't like it. I can understand why some people did though, but it just wasn't my cup of tea.
All right. Also, real quick before we go, September we are looking at doing a
You've got seconds.
Latinx authors. So if you have any, throw them at us. Otherwise, sorry about the messed up time, folks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks. See you next book.
Bye.